A young woman stopped at a car wash on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Her keys were still in the car. Her purse was sitting right there on the seat. Her money was untouched, and she was gone. No screaming, no broken glass, no signs of a fight. Just gone. And nobody, not a single person, heard a thing. Her name was Tiffany Johnston. She was 19 years old. 2 months before that Tuesday, she had walked down an aisle in a white dress and married the man she loved. His name was Ryan. They were newlyweds. They had just started building a life together in Bethany, Oklahoma, a quiet suburb just outside Oklahoma City. Tiffany wasn't a complicated girl. She had simple plans, a husband she loved, a routine she was just beginning to build. Tuesday nights meant meeting Ryan after his shift ended at 11. They had their spot, their little club, their small ordinary ritual as a new couple finding their rhythm. That Tuesday, July 26, 1997, she left the house as the sun was going down. She never made it to Ryan. Here is what we know about Tiffany's last confirmed hours. It was late that evening when she pulled into the Sunshine Car Wash on Northwest 23rd and Council Road in Bethany. The sky was dark. The lot was quiet. She pulled into a stall, took her car mats off the tires and hung them up on the wall exactly the way you do when you're about to wash a car. That is the last confirmed sighting of Tiffany Johnston alive. Now meet Sergeant John Reed. Reed was on duty that night, running a routine call somewhere else in Bethany. On his way, he drove past the Sunshine Car Wash and caught something small in his peripheral vision. A white Dodge Neon sitting alone in the far west stall. Nobody around it. He noted it, kept driving, finished his call. On the way back, he passed the car wash again. The Neon was still there. Same stall, same position. But now it was past midnight, and it was the only vehicle left in the entire lot. Reed pulled in. What he found made the hair stand up on the back of his neck. The car was unlocked, keys sitting in the ignition, purse on the seat with money still inside, and those car mats still hanging on the wall of the stall, exactly where someone had placed them before washing. Whoever owned this car had started washing it, and then had simply stopped existing. No shattered glass, no scattered belongings, no overturned anything. The scene around that car was completely, unnervingly calm. Reed ran the plates. The car belonged to a 19-year-old girl named Tiffany Johnston. He found a phone number for her mother inside the glove box. Her name was Kathy. She lived 60 miles away in Anadarko. It was the middle of the night when her phone rang. The officer on the other end asked one question. Was Tiffany with her? She wasn't. Kathy later said she knew before she even fully woke up. You don't get a midnight call from the police about your daughter when everything is fine. She told the officer Tiffany was supposed to be meeting Ryan. That was the plan. There was no plan anymore. Ryan Johnston had already been pacing for hours. His shift ended at 11. Tiffany wasn't there. She hadn't left a note. She wasn't answering. He got in his car and started driving, checking their usual spots, retracing routes, doing what a scared husband does when his gut is telling him something is wrong. Then his pager went off. He looked down at the number. It was a police station prefix. The kind of number you recognize the moment you see it and immediately wish you hadn't. He drove straight there. The officer at the desk didn't have good news. They had found Tiffany's car. She wasn't in it. She wasn't anywhere near it. Ryan Johnston walked into that station as a worried husband and walked out as a man whose world had just split in two, because now it wasn't worry anymore. It was something much worse. The next morning in Canadian County, a small search party was out in a field working a completely separate missing persons case. They were wrapping up when one of them noticed something odd about the tall grass alongside the highway. It wasn't swaying in the wind. It was pressed down, flattened, like something heavy had been laid on top of it. They stepped closer. A young woman was lying motionless in the dirt. It was clear a violent act had taken place, and the scene bore the unmistakable signs of a tragedy. They called it in immediately. Investigators arrived. A photograph was taken at the scene. That photograph was brought to Ryan Johnston. He didn't have to look for long. It was Tiffany. She was 19 years old. She had been married for exactly 60 days, and now she was a crime scene in a field that nobody was supposed to find. In every homicide investigation, there is an unwritten rulebook. The very first page of that rulebook says this: when a married woman is murdered, you start with the person who shares her bed. Bethany police had a dead wife. They had a crime scene with zero signs of a struggle near her car. They had a husband who, by his own account, had been driving the streets alone all night with no one to confirm where he was. To investigators, the math wasn't complicated. Ryan Johnston was no longer just a grieving newlywed. He was now the prime suspect. But Ryan Johnston didn't do it. And while the police were busy building a case against an innocent, broken husband, the real monster was already miles away, driving the dark Oklahoma highways, watching the rearview mirror, and searching for his next stop. When a woman is murdered, the police don't start with strangers. They start with the people closest to her. And in July of 1997, the person closest to Tiffany Johnston was a 20-something newlywed named Ryan, a man who had spent the entire night driving dark streets looking for his missing wife. To the investigators sitting across from him, that story didn't sound like grief. It sounded like an alibi being constructed in real time. Ryan Johnston was brought in and questioned. He told investigators everything: the shift that ended at 11, the drive around looking for Tiffany, the pager going off, the police station. He was cooperative. He was shaking. He answered every question they put in front of him. But here is the thing about homicide investigations. Cooperation doesn't clear you. Facts do. So investigators went to work verifying every single detail Ryan had given them. They talked to his coworkers. They pulled his work records. They confirmed his shift started at 3 in the afternoon and didn't end until 11 that night. Multiple people placed Ryan Johnston at his workplace during the exact hours Tiffany disappeared. The alibi was solid. But investigators weren't done. They asked Ryan to take a polygraph test. He said yes without hesitation. He passed. And then, even after the alibi, even after the polygraph, they asked him to provide a DNA sample, just to be thorough, just to be certain. Ryan Johnston agreed to that too. Think about what that moment meant. This man had just identified his wife's body in a photograph. He had just buried the woman he married 2 months ago. And now he was sitting in a police station trying to prove he didn't kill her. He was eliminated. Completely. Officially. Beyond any doubt, Ryan Johnston didn't kill Tiffany. The police knew it now, and they had to start over from zero. The investigation was bigger than Bethany could handle. The city's police department was small. They didn't have the manpower or the resources to run a full homicide investigation of this scale, so they called in the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. The OSBI took over, bringing in more experienced investigators and sharper tools. They worked every angle they had: co-workers, ex-boyfriends, acquaintances, anyone who had ever crossed paths with Tiffany, anyone whose name came up twice, anyone who had been at that car wash the night she disappeared. Buccal swabs were collected from every male person of interest in Tiffany's orbit, and one by one, each of them came back excluded. Nobody matched. In 1997, DNA testing was still in its early stages, and the samples from Tiffany's case yielded no answers. The investigation had no physical evidence pointing anywhere useful, no eyewitness who had seen anything at the car wash that night, no next step. The leads dried up, and then they stopped completely. Tiffany Johnston's case was filed away, cold. Her mother, Kathy, refused to let it stay that way. She called the Bethany Police Department regularly. Not once in a while, regularly. She pushed. She asked questions. She demanded to know if anyone was still working on her daughter's case. The answer, more often than not, was silence, not because nobody cared, but because there was genuinely nothing left to chase. Kathy later said that calling the police had become its own kind of grief, a way of telling the world that Tiffany still mattered, even when the world had long since moved on. Weeks became months, months became years, and the man who killed Tiffany Johnston was somewhere out there, breathing free air, living his life completely untouchable. But then, across the state line in Texas, a young woman was fighting for her life, and she would eventually crack this case wide open. Her name was Sandra Sapaw. She was 19 years old, and she was pregnant. It was May of 1997, 2 months before Tiffany's murder, when Sandra pulled into a parking lot near a Waffle House in Webster, Texas, and noticed something wrong with her car. Her tires had been slashed. She was stranded, alone, and then a man appeared. He offered to help. He was calm. He seemed friendly. He said he could give her a ride. Sandra didn't know that her tires hadn't gone flat by accident. She got in his truck. The moment the door closed, everything changed. Brandishing a weapon, he trapped her inside, demanding absolute compliance as he sped onto Interstate 45. Sandra Sapaw made a decision in that moment that saved her life. She watched. She waited. And she noticed that the back door of the truck wasn't fully locked. At 70 miles per hour on a Texas interstate, Sandra Sapaw made a harrowing leap for freedom, fracturing her way out of the moving vehicle. Against all odds, she survived the impact. The man in the truck panicked and sped away into the night. Here is the detail that made this case so painful for so long. Sandra had been through something so fast and so violent that she couldn't immediately put a name or a face to her attacker. She knew what he looked like, but identifying him, officially, legally, took time, and time was something Tiffany Johnston didn't have. In May, Sandra escaped. In July, Tiffany was murdered. Through the summer and into the fall, Sandra's attacker remained unidentified and free, driving the same highways, moving between Texas and Oklahoma, completely invisible to law enforcement. It wasn't until October of 1997, 3 full months after Tiffany's murder, that police in Texas finally arrested a man for Sandra's kidnapping. His mugshot ran on news stations across Texas and Oklahoma. The owner of the Sunshine Car Wash in Bethany was watching the evening news when a face flashed across his screen. His blood ran cold. He knew that face. The man on the screen was a regular customer at his car wash, someone who came in often, someone who drove a heavy white dually pickup truck and sometimes pulled a horse trailer behind it. He picked up the phone and called the police. Investigators finally had a name, William Lewis Reese. When the OSBI ran his background, the room went quiet. Reese was a convicted rapist who had served time in an Oklahoma prison. He had been released just 9 months before Tiffany's murder. He had lived in the Anadarko area, the same town where Kathy, Tiffany's mother, called home. And phone records confirmed that Reese had used a payphone in Yukon, Oklahoma, just minutes from the Sunshine Car Wash on the very night Tiffany disappeared. He was in the area. He had the history. He had the truck. But in 1997, suspicion wasn't enough for a warrant. There were no eyewitnesses to the abduction. Forensic science at the time couldn't bridge the gap. Investigators were staring directly at the man who almost certainly took Tiffany Johnston, and legally, their hands were completely tied. William Lewis Reese walked away into the shadows. The file was closed. The dust began to settle on Tiffany's case. But what the investigators in Oklahoma didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was the terrifying truth sitting just beneath the surface. They thought they were dealing with a desperate local suspect. They had no idea they were looking at a monster who was already leaving a trail of bodies across state lines. Before we go any further, you need to understand who William Lewis Reese actually was. Not the mugshot, not the court case, not the conviction, the man. Because when you look at William Reese from the outside, nothing about him screams monster. That is exactly what made him so dangerous. He was born in 1959 in Oklahoma, one of 13 children. He grew up on a farm near Yukon, just outside Oklahoma City. Parts of his childhood were spent in foster care, moving between homes, never fully rooted anywhere. His attorneys would later describe a difficult upbringing, a mother who could be harsh, a childhood without stability. He grew up, he found work, he shoed horses, he did construction, he drove trucks. On paper, William Lewis Reese looked like 1,000 other men living ordinary lives in rural Oklahoma. But underneath that ordinary surface, something had been building for years, and in 1986, it came out for the first time. April 1986, Norman, Oklahoma. A 19-year-old woman's car had broken down on the side of a highway. She was stranded, alone. Then a man in a semi-truck pulled over and offered her a ride. She accepted. He drove her away from the highway and pulled into a loading dock at an air conditioning plant. What happened next was violent, deliberate, and calculated. She survived only because she managed to attract the attention of a worker at the plant and got away. She went straight to the police. Reese didn't stop. 2 months later, in Anadarko, Oklahoma, a 20-year-old woman came home from a night out feeling unwell. She went to bed. She woke up in the dark to find William Reese looming over her inside her own home, inside her own bedroom, while her family slept just down the hall. Before she could call for help, he violently overpowered her, silencing her cries. She survived. She identified him. Reese was arrested, prosecuted, and convicted. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. He served 10. In October of 1996, the prison gates opened and William Lewis Reese walked back out into the world, a registered sex offender with a decade behind him and nothing in front of him but open highway. 9 months later, 4 young women were dead or missing. 9 months. That is all the time it took. April 3rd, 1997, Friendswood, Texas. The Smither family was making pancakes for breakfast on a quiet Thursday morning. Their daughter Laura, 12 years old, an aspiring ballerina, a Girl Scout, a kid described by everyone who knew her as someone who brought light into every room, asked her mother if she could go for a jog before eating. Her mother said yes. Laura laced up her shoes, stepped outside, and started running through her neighborhood. She was less than a quarter mile from her front door. She never came back. By that evening, thousands of volunteers had flooded the streets of Friendswood. Helicopters swept the fields. Mounted patrols combed the rural areas. The U.S. Marines flew in to help search. Her face was on flyers across the entire Houston area. For 17 days, her family waited. Laura's body was eventually found in a retention pond 10 miles from her home. She was 12 years old. She had gone jogging before breakfast, and she never made it back to the pancakes her family had made for her. Summer arrived. The highways stayed busy, and William Reese kept moving. July 15, 1997, Denton, Texas. Kelly Cox was 20 years old, a sharp, driven student at the University of North Texas studying criminology. That morning, her class took a field trip. They toured the local Denton jail. They walked through the cells, studying the mechanics of the criminal justice system up close. It was the kind of hands-on experience that makes a subject feel real. After the tour, Kelly stopped at a convenience store across the street from the jail. She called her boyfriend from a payphone and asked him to come meet her. He arrived minutes later. Kelly's car was there. Her keys were inside. But Kelly was gone. Let that land for a moment. In broad daylight, steps away from a building packed with armed law enforcement officers. A criminology student, someone who spent her days studying exactly how people become victims, had vanished without a single witness, without a single scream, without a single trace. For the next 19 years, her family would stare at her front door every single day, tormented by one question that had no answer. Where is our daughter? 11 days later, July 26, 1997, William Reese was in Bethany, Oklahoma, and Tiffany Johnston was at the Sunshine Car Wash. You already know how that night ended. But what you don't know yet, what investigators wouldn't discover until nearly 2 decades later, is the reason Reese was in Bethany that night. The connection between him and Tiffany that went far deeper than a random crossing of paths. That answer is coming. But first, the spree wasn't finished. August 1997, Tiki Island, Texas. Jessica Kane was 17 years old. That evening, she had been out celebrating with her friends, a cast party at a restaurant on the Gulf Freeway after a theater performance. It was the kind of night teenagers are supposed to have. Loud, happy, completely safe. She said goodbye to her friends, got in her car, and started driving home along Interstate 45. She never arrived. Her car was found abandoned on the side of the highway. The door was open. The engine was off. Her belongings were still inside. No Jessica. Her parents went public immediately. They stood in front of cameras with hollow eyes and begged for information. And the Houston community, still raw from Laura Smithers' disappearance just 4 months earlier, recognized the pattern with a sickening clarity. Another young woman, another abandoned car, another family destroyed. For years, Jessica Kane's case would remain unsolved. Her body would not be found for nearly 2 decades, and her family would spend every one of those years not knowing whether to grieve or keep hoping. Stop and look at what happened between April and August of 1997. 5 months, 4 young women, 2 states. Laura Smither, 12 years old, jogging before breakfast in her own neighborhood. Kelly Cox, 20 years old, standing outside a jail after a criminology class. Tiffany Johnston, 19 years old, washing her car on a Tuesday night before meeting her husband. Jessica Kane, 17 years old, driving home from a party with her friends. Not one of them made a wrong turn. Not one of them was in a dangerous place. Not one of them had any reason to believe that day would be different from any other. That is the most unsettling truth of this entire case. William Reese didn't hunt in dark alleys. He didn't wait in abandoned places. He operated in the most ordinary spaces of ordinary life. A neighborhood street, a parking lot, a car wash, a highway. He turned the normal world into a hunting ground. And for almost 20 years, he got away with it. By the fall of 1997, 4 families across Texas and Oklahoma were living in a kind of agony that has no name. Kelly Cox's family stared at an empty bedroom. Jessica Kane's parents drove I-45 over and over, searching the roadsides. Laura Smithers' mother and father had buried their daughter but had no justice. And Kathy Dobry, Tiffany's mother, was calling the Bethany Police Department every few weeks just to make sure someone still remembered her daughter's name. William Reese, meanwhile, was sitting in a Texas prison on a 60-year kidnapping sentence for Sandra Sappa's abduction, convicted, locked away, safe from the world. But here is what nobody knew. Nobody had connected the dots yet. Nobody had linked Reese to Laura, to Kelly, to Tiffany, to Jessica. As far as the world was concerned, those 4 cases were separate tragedies in separate cities investigated by separate departments. The man responsible for all of it was in prison, not for the murders, but for the one victim who got away. 4 families had no answers. 4 cases were cold. And the only thing that stood between William Reese and a lifetime of silence was a set of forgotten swabs sitting in an evidence locker in Oklahoma. Nobody had touched those swabs in 15 years. But in 2012, one investigator decided it was time to look again, and what she found inside that evidence bag would finally start pulling on the one thread that William Reese could not control, his own DNA. It was 2012. Tiffany Johnston had been dead for 15 years. Her case file was sitting in a cold case drawer. Her mother, Kathy, had stopped getting callbacks from the police. The leads had dried up so long ago that most of the investigators who originally worked the case had retired or moved on entirely. But one person hadn't given up. OSBI Special Agent Tammy Blankenship pulled Tiffany's file, walked it to the forensic lab, and asked one simple question. With everything science can do today that it couldn't do in 1997, can we try again? The answer was yes. The lab technicians opened the evidence bags that had been sealed since Tiffany's autopsy 15 years earlier. What they found inside was fragile. DNA doesn't last forever. Over time, biological material breaks down, it degrades, it deteriorates, it loses the clarity it once had. 15 years in storage had taken a serious toll on what little sample existed. The technician who later testified at trial described the process carefully. She could only pull a fraction of the information that a fresh sample would have provided. What she extracted was a partial DNA profile, not complete, not clean. Not enough to run through CODIS, the national DNA database that law enforcement uses to match biological evidence to known offenders. But it was something. It was the biological fingerprint of a man who had been with Tiffany Johnston on the night she was murdered. And that partial profile was about to become the most important piece of evidence in the entire case. If they couldn't run the profile through a database, they would do this the hard way. They went back to every single person who had ever been connected to Tiffany Johnston, every coworker, every ex-boyfriend, every acquaintance, every man whose name had ever appeared in the original investigation, and collected buccal swabs from all of them, one by one, methodically, completely. They contacted men Tiffany had worked with, men she had dated before Ryan, people who had been at the car wash the night she disappeared, witnesses from the original case, names pulled from the margins of 15-year-old notebooks. And then, even though Ryan Johnston had already been cleared years ago, even though he had passed a polygraph and provided a sample back in 1997, investigators went back to Ryan again, because this was too important to leave any stone unturned. Ryan Johnston, who had spent 15 years living with the loss of his wife, sat down and gave another swab without hesitation. The results came back. Ryan was excluded. Every single man they tested was excluded. Every one of them, except one. William Lewis Reese. He was the only person connected to this case who had never been formally eliminated. In 2013, OSBI investigators reached out to former Texas Ranger Stephen Jeter. Reese was already sitting in a Texas prison, serving his 60-year sentence for Sandra Sapaw's kidnapping. Ranger Jeter made the drive to Huntsville prison and sat down across from William Reese. He asked for a buccal swab. Reese agreed. The swab was packaged and sent to the OSBI forensic lab in Oklahoma. Then came the wait. 2 years. In criminal investigations, 2 years feels like an eternity. 2 years of Kathy Dobry not knowing. 2 years of Ryan Johnston carrying the weight of an unsolved case. 2 years of 4 families across Texas and Oklahoma living in the same silence they had lived in since 1997. In 2015, the results finally came back. The partial DNA profile extracted from Tiffany's evidence matched the known puzzle pieces of William Reese's direct sample. It was not a perfect, irrefutable 100% match. The degradation had seen to that. But the forensic investigator's testimony was precise and unmistakable. William Reese could not be excluded as the source of that biological material. Every other man had been eliminated. Reese had not. 15 years of silence had just developed its first crack. But investigators understood something immediately. A partial DNA match in a court of law is not a conviction. A defense attorney would stand in front of that jury and explain, correctly, that a degraded partial profile leaves room for doubt, that it could theoretically point to Reese or any of his paternal male relatives, that the science, while compelling, wasn't perfect. To put William Reese on death row for Tiffany Johnston's murder, they needed more than a lab result. They needed him to say it himself. Enter Texas Ranger Jim Holland. Holland was not the kind of investigator who walked into a room with a raised voice and a set of accusations. He was something far more dangerous than that. He was patient, he was methodical, and he understood something that most people don't, that when you are sitting across from a man who has spent decades protecting himself, the worst thing you can do is attack. The best thing you can do is make him believe that silence no longer serves him. In 2016, Holland sat down with William Reese inside a Texas prison visiting room and began what would become one of the most consequential interrogations in Oklahoma criminal history. He didn't accuse. He didn't threaten. He laid information on the table, quietly, carefully, one piece at a time. The first thing Holland put in front of Reese was the calling card data. Phone records from 1997 showed that William Reese had used a payphone in Yukon, Oklahoma, just minutes from the Sunshine Car Wash in Bethany around the time of Tiffany's disappearance. Holland let that land. Then he let the silence sit. He told Reese calmly that investigators already knew he had been in Oklahoma that summer. They had the records. They had the DNA result. The question was no longer whether Reese was connected to Tiffany Johnston's case. The question was whether Reese was going to help himself or not. And then Reese said something that made the room go completely still. He admitted he knew of Tiffany Johnston, not from the news, not from following the case. Personally, Tiffany's mother, Kathy, was the best friend of Reese's own mother. Their families had been connected through the small, tight-knit communities of rural Oklahoma for years. Reese had never met Tiffany, had never seen a photograph of her. But her name existed somewhere in the web of his world long before that Tuesday night in July. He had not stumbled onto a complete stranger at that car wash. He had stumbled onto the daughter of a woman his own mother had known for decades. That admission, quiet, almost casual in the way Reese delivered it, was the moment investigators knew they had him. An innocent man does not casually know the hidden family history of a cold case murder victim. A killer does. Armed with the threat of the Oklahoma death penalty, Ranger Jim Holland leaned forward. He wasn't just there to close Tiffany's case. He wanted answers about the missing girls of 1997, the ones whose families were still waiting, the ones whose names had never left the cold case boards in Texas. Holland made the situation clear to Reese. Oklahoma was pursuing the death penalty. But cooperation, real cooperation, the kind that meant leading investigators to the truth, might influence how things moved forward. It wasn't a promise. Holland was careful never to make a promise he couldn't keep. But he made one thing absolutely clear. Silence had no upside left for William Lewis Reese. Inside that prison visiting room, something shifted. Reese looked at the ranger across the table. He took a breath, and he agreed to talk. Not just about Oklahoma, not just about one car wash on one Tuesday night in 1997, about everything, about the secrets he had carried for 19 years, about the things he had buried, not just in his memory, but deep in the fields and swamps of rural Texas. He was ready to lead them to the graves. What law enforcement was about to unearth in the soil of Texas would shock every family that had been waiting since 1997, and it would set in motion the most dramatic courtroom showdown Oklahoma had seen in decades. The truth was finally coming out. All of it. It was 2016. William Lewis Reese had agreed to talk. But talking wasn't enough. Ranger Jim Holland needed proof. Real proof. The kind that couldn't be argued away in a courtroom. And Reese had offered something that no confession alone could provide. He offered to show them. What happened next is one of the most haunting images in this entire case. William Lewis Reese, dressed in an orange prison jumpsuit, hands in handcuffs, surrounded by law enforcement, was driven out into the swamps and fields of rural Texas. He directed them. In Brazoria County, investigators were led to a remote, flooded field, overgrown, brutal in the summer heat, the kind of place you drive past 1,000 times and never once think to look. Crews worked for weeks in those conditions, digging through mud and water, searching for something that had been buried 19 years ago. Then they found her, skeletal remains, carefully examined, carefully documented. Kelly Cox, the criminology student who had vanished from a parking lot across from a jail on July 15, 1997. After 19 years of silence, her family finally had an answer, not the answer they had prayed for, but the one they had always feared, and the one they needed to finally stop waiting. Then Reese led investigators to southeast Houston, to a field behind a bar on the edge of the city. They dug again. Jessica Kane, 17 years old, the girl who had driven away from a cast party in August 1997 and simply never arrived home. Her parents had spent 19 years driving Interstate 45, scanning the roadsides, keeping her bedroom exactly as she had left it, just in case she came back. Just in case there was still something to hope for. Now they knew. There was a particular kind of grief in those moments that doesn't have a name. It is not the sharp, sudden grief of fresh loss. It is the grief of a question finally answered. 20 years too late, in a muddy field, in the heat of a Texas summer, by a man in handcuffs pointing at the ground. Two families exhaled for the first time in 2 decades, and 2 more families were finally able to begin. The wheels of justice, once they started turning, moved toward one destination: Oklahoma City, a courtroom, and a trial that had been delayed for years, first by legal proceedings, then by a global pandemic that shut down court systems across the country. It wasn't until May of 2021, 24 years after Tiffany Johnston stopped at the Sunshine Car Wash, that William Lewis Reese finally sat down in an Oklahoma County courtroom to face what he had done. The trial lasted nearly 3 weeks. Bethany Police Chief John Reed, the same officer who had noticed that abandoned white Dodge Neon all those years ago, took the stand and described exactly what he had found that night: the keys in the ignition, the purse on the seat, the car mat still hanging on the wall. Ryan Johnston testified about what had been taken from him. Not just Tiffany, but the life they were supposed to build together, the children they never had, the years that simply ceased to exist the moment she walked into that car wash stall. Medical experts testified about the evidence. Forensic analysts walked the jury through the DNA process, the degradation, the partial profile, the elimination of every other suspect, and then the prosecution played the tapes. The courtroom went quiet, not hushed, not subdued, completely, unnervingly quiet. Because what came through those speakers was William Lewis Reese's own voice, calm, unhurried, almost conversational, describing in detail what he had done to Tiffany Johnston on the night of July 26, 1997. He described the argument at the car wash, confrontation over water that escalated into violence. Throwing Tiffany into the horse trailer, what happened inside that trailer in the heat of a July evening. He described Tiffany fighting back, grabbing a horseshoe and striking him with it, and then he described what he did next. He strangled her, first with his hands, then with a rope used to lead horses. He described it the way someone describes a problem they solved, without remorse, without weight, without anything that resembled the recognition that he had ended a human life. That calmness, that flat, emotionless tone on those tapes was perhaps the most disturbing thing the jury heard across the entire 3 weeks of testimony. This was not a man haunted by what he had done. This was a man who had simply moved on. The defense did what they could. They argued the confession had been coerced, that Ranger Holland had dangled the death penalty like a weapon, and that Reese had only talked to save himself. They pointed to the imperfect DNA match. They called a psychologist who testified for more than 5 hours about Reese's below-average IQ, his PTSD, his difficult childhood. During cross-examination, prosecutors asked the psychologist a single pointed question: can PTSD be caused by committing multiple rapes and murders? The doctor answered yes. The defense rested without calling a single witness of their own to refute the evidence. The jury left the courtroom to deliberate. They came back in less than 1 hour. Guilty. First-degree murder. Kidnapping. On every count. The verdict took longer to read than it took the jury to reach it. The sentencing phase brought the families into the room. Kathy Dobry, Tiffany's mother, sat in that courtroom and watched the man who had killed her daughter finally face consequences. She had been calling the Bethany Police Department for years, pushing, demanding, refusing to let her daughter's name disappear into a filing cabinet. She had waited 24 years for this moment. Gay Smither, Laura's mother, was there too. The woman who had said yes to a morning jog and spent the next 2 decades carrying that moment. She had built an entire non-profit organization in her daughter's name. She had channeled 24 years of grief into something that protected other families from the same fate. And now she sat in a courtroom in Oklahoma City, watching the man responsible face a jury. And then there was Kelly Cox's daughter. She had been a toddler in 1997, too young to understand what had happened, old enough to feel the absence. She had looked under beds. She had looked in closets. Every time she saw a car the same color as her mother's, she would say the word, Mommy. She was 20 years old when she finally found out what had happened. 20 years old when she learned that her mother hadn't left. Her mother had been taken. She sat in that courtroom and heard, for the first time, the full truth of what William Lewis Reese had done. The defense called witnesses to beg for mercy. They spoke about Reese's childhood, his instability, his mental health. They asked the jury to consider the full picture of the man. The jury considered it. And then they recommended death. On August 19, 2021, Oklahoma County District Judge Susan Stallings looked across the courtroom at William Lewis Reese and asked if he had anything to say before she handed down his sentence. He did not. Judge Stallings spoke 4 words that Kathy Dobry had been waiting 24 years to hear. Justice will not be delayed. She sentenced William Lewis Reese to death. After the verdict, Reese was transferred back to Texas, where he stood in 2 more courtrooms and pleaded guilty to the murders of Laura Smither, Kelly Cox, and Jessica Kane. He received 3 consecutive life sentences. Then, in January of 2026, he was transferred back to Oklahoma, to the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, where he now sits on death row. His appeals have been working their way through the courts. In July of 2025, the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals unanimously upheld his death sentence, rejecting every argument his attorneys had made. His case now sits before the United States Supreme Court. The Oklahoma Attorney General's office has stated clearly they will oppose every appeal. And when the last appeal is exhausted, they will request an execution date. William Lewis Reese will die in a prison cell. But here is what Kathy Dobry said after the verdict, not with relief, not with triumph, with the quiet, worn honesty of a mother who had been fighting for 24 years and knew exactly what justice could and could not give her back. There will never be closure. She was right. No verdict brings Tiffany back to the Tuesday night she was supposed to have. No death sentence gives Ryan Johnston back the life he was building with his wife. No courtroom moment returns Laura Smither to the breakfast table, or puts Kelly Cox back in her criminology class, or drives Jessica Kane safely home from that cast party. The families got truth. They got accountability. They got the knowledge that William Lewis Reese will never stand in another parking lot, another car wash, another neighborhood street, and destroy another ordinary moment. But closure? Closure was never on the table. Tiffany Johnston stopped at a car wash on an ordinary Tuesday evening in 1997. She was 19 years old. She had been married for 60 days. She had her whole life sitting right in front of her. She hung her car mats on the wall of the stall. She was going to meet her husband at 11. It was just another Tuesday. She never got to grow old. She never got to have children. She never got to say goodbye to the people who loved her. She never got to finish washing her car. Some monsters don't hide in the dark. Some of them pull into the stall right next to yours in a white dually pickup truck on an ordinary evening, and the whole world keeps moving like nothing is wrong. Because nothing looked wrong. That is the part that stays with you. If this case made you think differently about the people we trust in ordinary places, drop a comment below and tell us why. If you believe William Reese deserves to face execution for what he did to these 4 families, or if you think the story is more complicated than that, we want to hear your perspective.